Some acts of cruelty don't announce themselves with violence. They arrive quietly, wrapped in the language of justice, carried out by men who believe they're doing right. The woman sat in the center of the square with a burlap sack pulled tight over her head, thick rope binding her wrist behind her back. The crowd watched from the wooden walkway, arms crossed, faces hard. They called her the Beast, said she'd been stealing cattle for months, living wild in the hills like an animal. But no one had actually seen her face in years. The sack had been Garrett Holloway's idea, said it was for everyone's protection, that looking at her might bring bad fortune. The truth was simpler and uglier. They wanted to strip away the last piece of her humanity. The morning sun beat down on Red Mesa with the kind of heat that makes men mean and dogs hide under porches. It was September 1886, just days after Geronimo's surrender had made headlines from Arizona to Washington. The Apache Wars were over, they said. The savage threat had been neutralized. The frontier was safe for civilization. But old hatreds die hard, and fear has a long memory. Nalin had stopped struggling an hour ago, stopped making any sound at all. The men who dragged her here had enjoyed that silence. They took it as proof of guilt, evidence of the animal nature they'd always suspected. Her wrists were raw where the rope had cut into skin, blood dried black in the Arizona dust. The sack smelled of feed and mildew, rough burlap scratching against her face with every labored breath. She could feel the sun through the fabric, feel the weight of 50 pairs of eyes watching, judging, condemning. Through the rough weave that scraped her cheeks with each breath, Nalin could see only darkness and dancing spots of light where the sun burned through the thinner patches of fabric. The rope around her wrists had been tied with brutal efficiency. She recognized the knot. Cavalry hitch. The same kind the soldiers had used 3 years ago at Cañon de los Embudos. The same kind that had bound Tarak's hands before they shot him. She thought of Ashki now, her son. 6 years old when the soldiers came at dawn, rifles ready, voices barking orders in a language most of her people barely understood. 6 years old when they put a bullet in his small chest because he'd cried out for his father. She thought of Tarak, her husband, who died trying to shield their boy with his own body. Both failures, both deaths she'd been forced to witness before she ran like a coward into the mountains, leaving their bodies behind in the dust. 3 years she'd survived alone in Devil's Spine Ridge. 3 years of hunting deer and rabbit with her bow, of finding water in places white men would die of thirst, of moving from cave to cave like the animal they claimed she was. 3 years of being called beast, witch, savage, of having rocks thrown at her when she came to trade the few furs she could spare for salt and flour, of seeing mothers pull their children away when she passed, as if her very shadow carried contamination. And now this, sitting in the dirt while they debated her fate like she was livestock gone bad, waiting to see if they'd settle for humiliation or if the rope around her wrist would end up around her neck. Garrett Holloway stood on the boardwalk in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, thumbs hooked in his vest pockets. He cut an impressive figure at 55, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with graying hair swept back from a weathered face that had seen its share of frontier hardship and come out on top. His black wool vest cost more than most men earned in a month. The gold watch chain across his stomach caught the sunlight. 14-karat gold with a Waltham Railroad-grade timepiece attached. $50 right there. His boots were handmade, custom-fitted leather from a cobbler in Tucson who charged $5 a pair. He'd been a cavalry captain once, had ridden with General Crook against the Apache in the campaigns of the early 80s. People trusted Garrett Holloway. People listened when he spoke. He'd been one of the founders of Red Mesa back in 1878, had built the first permanent structure, had brought law and order to a stretch of territory that had been nothing but dust and danger. His ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory. That trust had made him bold. That respect had made him dangerous. "Folks," Garrett called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. It was the voice of command, honed by years of ordering men into battle. "I know this isn't pleasant. I know some of you are uncomfortable with what you are seeing here. But justice isn't always pleasant. Justice is about protecting what's ours, our families, our property, or our way of life." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled townspeople. 53 men, women, and children, nearly a quarter of Red Mesa's entire population. They'd come to witness justice, or what passed for it. This woman has been stealing from us for months, Garrett continued, from my ranch, from Henry Cole's spread, from Caleb Morrison's place. 18 head of cattle from me alone. That's $360 in losses. He let that number hang in the air. $360. A ranch hand made $30 a month if he was lucky. 12 months of wages, gone. Henry lost 12 head. Caleb lost 9 plus 2 good horses. That's 39 head of cattle and 2 horses. Total market value based on current prices in Tucson, approximately $850. A murmur ran through the crowd. $850. It was a fortune. It was the difference between a ranch surviving the winter or going under. It was food for children and medicine for the sick, and seed for spring planting. We've all seen the pattern, Garrett said. Cattle disappearing in the night, always from the pastures closest to the mountains. No tracks leading away that we could find. No trace of where they went or who took them. And there she sits. He gestured toward Nayland without looking at her. Living up in Devil's Spine Ridge with no visible means of support, no crops planted, no herd of her own, no trade goods to sell, no husband to provide for her. So I ask you, how does she survive? What does she eat? Where does her flour come from? Henry Cole, a weathered man of 58 with skin like old leather from 4 decades under the southwestern sun, shifted his weight on the boardwalk. His wife, Rosemary, stood beside him, her face troubled. Henry cleared his throat. Garrett's right. I've lost cattle I couldn't afford to lose. Winter's coming. Feed's expensive. Every head counts. Caleb Morrison, the blacksmith, who also ran a small ranch on the east side of town, nodded his agreement. He was a man of few words, built like a bull from years of working the forge. When Caleb spoke, people listened. Lost 9 head and 2 good horses. A man works hard for what he has. Somebody takes it. That's theft, plain and simple. We're civilized people, Garrett said, his voice taking on a tone of righteous conviction. We don't take the law into our own hands like savages. We don't lynch. We don't murder in the dark. We display the guilty. We let them feel the weight of their sin, let the community bear witness to justice. And then we turn them over to the proper authorities for trial and punishment according to law. He paused for effect. Marshal Tanner is due to arrive tomorrow morning from Tucson. He'll take her to stand trial. Until then, she sits here as a reminder. Theft has consequences. Lawlessness has consequences. We are not animals. We are Americans building a civilization in the wilderness. Reverend Thomas Wright stood near the front of the crowd, a tall man of 62 with white hair and the kind of face that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone harshly. He'd been a chaplain in the war between the states, had administered last rites to dying boys in blue and gray alike. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his lips moved in what might have been prayer or might have been doubt. 3 boys, none older than 13, edged closer to Nolan from the side. The smallest one, a freckled kid named Billy Meeks, picked up a stone the size of a walnut. He glanced at his friends, Tommy and Will, both grinning with that particular cruelty of young boys who don't yet understand consequences. Billy wound up and threw. The stone struck Nolan's shoulder, just above where the rough fabric of her buckskin dress covered her collarbone. Not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to hurt. She flinched, her body jerking involuntarily, but she made no sound. Wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The boys laughed and scattered back into the safety of the crowd like quail flushing from cover. No one stopped them. No one said a word. A few women looked away, ashamed, but silence is complicity, and they all knew it. When James Crawford rode into Red Mesa that Tuesday morning, he had no intention of getting involved in anyone's trouble. He'd come looking for work, nothing more. His Appaloosa gelding, Dusty, was tired after 3 days of hard riding from New Mexico territory, where a job had gone bad, and Jim had decided it was time to move on. That was the pattern of his life now. Work a ranch for 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year if the owner didn't ask too many questions. Then something would remind him of Texas, of Mary, of the man he'd killed, and he'd drift on like tumbleweed in a high wind. Jim himself looked like 40 miles of bad road, unshaven and trail-worn. his blue cotton shirt stained with dust and wet, and the kind of grime that comes from sleeping on the ground. He wore his Stetson pulled low against the sun, the brim casting shadows across a face that had seen 33 years of hard living and looked older. His jaw was strong, his eyes the gray blue of a winter sky before snow, and his hands were the scarred, capable hands of a man who'd spent his life working with animals and machines and occasionally other men's faces. His Winchester Model 1873 rested in the saddle scabbard at his knee, chambered in 44-40 caliber. The same ammunition fit his Colt 45 Peacemaker that rode on his right hip in a worn leather holster tied down at the thigh. Not the guns of a troublemaker, just the tools of a man who'd learned that the frontier respected strength and punished weakness, and that being unarmed in Apache country was a quick way to die young. Dusty's hooves made soft clopping sounds on the hard-packed dirt of Main Street. The town was bigger than Jim had expected. A dozen commercial buildings, 2 saloons, a hotel, a general store, a livery stable, a blacksmith's forge that doubled as a farrier shop, maybe 50 houses scattered around the central square. A church steeple rose at the south end, white paint peeling in the relentless sun. Population maybe 250 souls, all trying to carve out a living in a land that killed the weak and crippled the strong. Jim had grown up on a ranch in the Texas Panhandle, good land with good water, 3 generations of Crawfords working the same soil. His grandfather had fought Comanche back in the 40s. His father had built the ranch into something worth having, 2,000 acres and 500 head of cattle. Jim had been the youngest of 3 boys, the one who'd learned to gentle horses that other men couldn't touch, who could fix a windmill or a wagon wheel or a fence line, who could read cattle like some men read books. He'd been 28 when his sister Mary married Thomas Garrett. Not the same Garrett as stood on the boardwalk now. Different name, same kind of man. Thomas had been charming at first, attentive, the kind of suitor fathers approved of. Steady work, good prospects, fine family. The bruises hadn't started appearing until 6 months after the wedding. Mary had been 20 when the accidents began. Clumsy, she'd said, walked into a door, fell down the stairs, tripped over her own feet. Jim had known better. Everyone had known better, but it was family business, private business, not the kind of thing a man interfered with. That's what his father had said. That's what the preacher had said. That's what the other women had whispered while looking at their own feet. That's what Jim had told himself every time he saw his sister flinch when her husband raised his voice. Every time he noticed her wearing long sleeves in summer to hide the fingerprint bruises on her arms. Until the morning they found her body in the barn, neck broken. Thomas passed out drunk beside her with her blood on his knuckles. Jim had killed him. Not in hot blood, though the ray had been there, volcanic and all-consuming. He'd waited 3 hours for Thomas to wake up. Waited so the man would know exactly why he was dying, so he could see it coming, so he could feel one moment of the fear that Mary had lived with every day. Then Jim had put a bullet through his brain and ridden away before the law could arrive. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of drifting, working ranches under different names, never staying long enough for his past to catch up. 5 years of carrying his father's pocket watch in his vest, the silver case warm against his ribs, the inscription on the back a constant reminder and accusation. Honor above all. His father's creed, the Crawford family motto, the promise Jim had broken when he let his sister die. He'd failed that honor once. He wouldn't fail it again. The crowd in the square caught his attention as he walked Dusty slowly down Main Street. Too many people for a Tuesday morning when everyone should be working. Too much tension in the air, thick and electric like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Curiosity drew him closer, the way a man slows down to look at a wagon wreck even when he knows he shouldn't. Then he saw the woman sitting in the dirt with the sack over her head, and something inside him broke open like a wound that had never properly healed. The burlap sack was the kind used for feed grain, rough and dirty. The rope binding her wrist behind her back was good manila hemp, half-inch diameter, tied with a precision that spoke of military training. Her buckskin dress was torn at one shoulder, stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. She sat perfectly still, not struggling, not making a sound, just breathing in and out while 50 people watched her suffer and called it justice. Jim's hands tightened on the reins. Dusty felt the tension and sidestepped nervously, ears flicking back. Every instinct Jim had honed over 5 years of survival screamed at him to keep riding. This wasn't his town, wasn't his problem, wasn't his business. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's troubles was a quick way to end up dead or running. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the pocket watch through his vest. He could feel the engraved letters through the fabric, worn smooth by his father's thumb over 40 years. Honor above all. He'd ridden past once before. Let his sister die, because he'd been too afraid, too respectful of social conventions, too willing to believe it wasn't his business. And Mary had died alone and afraid in a barn, while Jim told himself he was doing the right thing by staying out of it. Not again. Never again. Jim dismounted in one smooth motion, the kind of movement that spoke of decades in the saddle. He tied Dusty's reins to a hitching post in front of the general store and walked toward the crowd. People moved aside without being asked. Something in the set of his shoulders, the deliberate pace of his stride, the way his eyes fixed on that woman in the dirt. Something that said this stranger was dangerous and determined and not to be trifled with. The crowd parted like water around a stone. Men stepped back. Women pulled their children close. Everyone watched this tall, dusty cowboy walk straight toward the center of the square where justice was being served. Jim knelt beside Nalin in the dust, the hot dirt soaking through his denim trousers at the knees. Up close, he could see the rope had been tied with military precision, a cavalry hitch designed to hold even under violent struggle. The knot showed no sign of loosening. It had been tied to hurt. The burlap sack had been pulled so tight around her neck that he could see red marks on her brown skin where the fabric met flesh, abrading and chafing with every movement. Her wrists were bleeding, the hemp rope stained dark with it, blood dripping slowly into the dust to make small, dark circles in the Arizona dirt. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his Texas drawl soft but carrying easily in the sudden silence. "I'm going to take this sack off. I'm not going to hurt you. Just hold still, now." Nayland went rigid at the sound of his voice. Her whole body tensed like a trapped animal expecting a blow, muscles coiling, breath catching. Her breathing quickened, the sack rising and falling faster, the sound of her fear audible through the rough fabric. But she didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't plead or bargain or pray, just waited to see what new cruelty the stranger had planned. "That woman is a thief and a danger to this community." The voice came from the boardwalk, male and authoritative, used to being obeyed. Jim didn't look up. He focused on the knot at the base of Nalin's skull, working his fingers into the tight hemp, feeling for the tail end that would release the tension. His hands were steady despite the anger building in his chest. "You've got no business interfering, stranger." Jim's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I got business with cruelty wherever I find it, mister." The knot was tight, tied by someone who knew their work, but Jim had spent 33 years working with rope, and he knew knots the way some men know cards. He found the working end, traced it back through the hitch, and pulled. The knot came loose with a soft sound. The sack stayed in place for a moment, held by sweat and pressure and the shape of Nalin's head, before Jim carefully pulled it away. What he saw underneath stopped his breath. Not a beast, not a monster, not the savage animal the crowd had been expecting. Just a woman with dark eyes wide with fear and confusion, and a desperate kind of hope that hurt to witness. Black hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, hanging in tangled strands past her shoulders. A long scar running from her right cheekbone down to her jaw, the kind of wound a bayonet makes when a soldier's aim is off and he catches flesh instead of throat. Lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Dirt smeared across her face where the sack had rubbed, and a face that had seen too much pain to trust kindness when it appeared. But what struck Jim most was her eyes. Dark brown, almost black, like river stones polished by water. Eyes that had seen her husband and son murdered. Eyes that had watched her entire people destroyed. Eyes that had survived 3 years alone in the wilderness. Eyes that held no surrender despite everything. Nullen looked at him. Really looked, studying this stranger who'd knelt in the dirt beside her, saw a man with worn clothes and careful hands, with eyes that held their own ghosts, saw someone who'd chosen to step forward when the rest of the world had been content to watch her suffer. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, maybe. The kind of recognition that happens between people who've both lost everything and kept living anyway. Or just the shared understanding of what it means to be alone in a place that wants you gone. Step aside, stranger. Jim rose to his feet slowly, deliberately, positioning himself between Nayland and the man on the boardwalk. Garrett Holloway. Jim could tell from the expensive clothes, the confident stance, the way every eye in the square kept glancing his direction for approval. This was a man used to being obeyed. Garrett descended the wooden steps, his boots striking the planks with authority. 3 men followed him down, 2 ranch hands in dusty work clothes, weathered and hard-eyed, the kind of men who did what they were told and didn't ask questions. And a younger man, maybe 28, with Garrett's jawline and shoulders and the same cold eyes. Nephew or cousin, the kind who'd be loyal unto stupidity and beyond. "This isn't your concern," Garrett said, stopping about 10 feet away, close enough to make his point, far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. "Seems like it is now," Jim said. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but the possibility hung in the air like smoke. "You don't know what she's done." "Then tell me, with words, not a sack over her head. That's not justice, that's cruelty." The crowd murmured, some approving, some uncertain. An old man in a preacher's collar took a step forward from the boardwalk, his weathered face troubled, but his mouth still closed. Reverend Wright. Jim had seen his type before. Good men who wanted to do right but couldn't quite bring themselves to stand against the crowd. Garrett's face hardened like sun-baked clay. "Fine, you want the full story? You'll get it." He raised his voice, playing to the crowd now, turning this confrontation into theater. "She's been stealing from us for 2 months solid, 18 head of prime cattle from my ranch alone, at $20 a head average market price. That's $360 in losses. $360 that should have fed my family, paid my hands, bought seed for spring planting." He turned slightly, including the watching townspeople in his narrative. "Henry Cole lost 12 head. 12 head from a man who can barely afford to lose 2. Caleb Morrison lost 9 head of cattle, plus 2 good horses worth $30 each. That's a total of 39 head of cattle and 2 horses. Total market value, being generous in assuming average weight and condition, approximately $850. A woman in a faded calico dress gasped, $850. More money than most of these people would see in 2 years. "The losses always happen at night," Garrett continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a prosecutor making his case. "Always from the pastures closest to the mountains. We found no tracks leading away, no sign of where they went or how they were moved. And where does this woman live?" He pointed west toward the jagged ridge that dominated the horizon. "Right there, Devil's Spine Ridge. In caves like an animal, no crops planted, no livestock of her own, no visible means of support, no husband to provide for her, no family to help her. So I ask you, stranger, and I ask everyone here, how does she survive? What does she eat? Where does her flour come from? How does she get salt and coffee and the other necessities of life?" Garrett's logic was sound, Jim had to admit. It made a kind of sense if you didn't think too hard about the details. 2 days ago, Garrett said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous, "My men found her near the north pasture, right where our last losses occurred. Her buckskin dress was stained with fresh blood. Not dried, not from days ago. Fresh blood from a recent kill." Jim glanced down at Nayland. She was staring at the ground now, her jaw set, blood still dripping slowly from her torn wrists onto the dust. Her hands were beginning to swell from the tight binding. "Ma'am," Jim said, his voice gentle, "is that true? About the blood?" When Nayland spoke, her voice came out rough and low, like someone who hadn't used it in days. The words carried the distinct accent of someone for whom English was not a first language. The Apache lilt that turns some consonants soft and others hard in unexpected places. "I took nothing from these men. The blood was from a deer I hunted in the high country. I killed it with my bow. I butchered it. I ate the meat. That is all I have done. Hunt to live. That is not theft." Of course she'd say that, Garrett scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. Apaches always lie when they're caught. It's in their nature. They're raiders. Always have been. Everyone knows it. Nalen's eyes flashed with rage, sudden and violent as a lightning strike. Her jaw clenched, her shoulders went back, and for a moment Jim thought she might lunge at Garrett despite the ropes, despite the crowd, despite the certainty of death that would follow. But she controlled it, channeled that fury into silence, into stillness, into a kind of dignity that was more powerful than any words. That control told Jim something important. Told him she'd survived worse than this. Told him she was stronger than any of these people understood. Jim turned his attention back to Garrett, his mind working through the logic. You see her take the cattle with your own eyes? Don't need to, Garrett said flatly. She's the only one living in those hills. Cattle don't just wander off and disappear on their own. How would one woman on foot move 39 head of cattle and 2 horses across 20 miles of rough country without leaving tracks? Jim let the question hang there, his voice reasonable, his tone mild, but the implication cutting. Cattle are stupid animals, but they don't walk in single file. 39 head would tear up ground like a cavalry troop. You'd be able to track them from 5 miles away. The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of doubt spreading through the crowd. Several people shifted their weight, glancing at each other. One woman leaned close to whisper to her husband. A man in a storekeeper's apron scratched his chin thoughtfully. The logistics didn't make sense when you stopped to think about it. But prejudice doesn't require logic. Fear doesn't need facts. She didn't do it alone, Garrett said smoothly, his voice still confident, still authoritative. There are others, renegades, and holdouts who refuse to go to the reservation. Everyone knows there are still Apache hiding in those mountains. Geronimo surrendered less than a week ago. You think all his people just magically appeared at the surrender? Some of them are still out there. Then why arrest only her? Jim pressed. Why not track the others? If there's a whole band of renegade Apaches stealing cattle, seems like one woman is the least of your problems. Because she's the one we caught. Garrett's patience was fraying now, anger seeping through the cracks in his reasonable facade. Look, stranger, I don't know who you are or where you're from, or why you think you can ride into our town and question how do we handle our business. But I'll tell you one time and one time only, step aside, let justice take its course, or there'll be trouble you're not prepared for. Jim's hand still didn't move toward his gun, but his stance shifted slightly, weight settling on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The 2 ranch hands behind Garrett noticed. Their own hands drifted toward their weapons. The younger man, the one with Garrett's jaw, took a half step forward. The crowd went very still, sensing violence in the air, like animals before a storm. The standoff might have turned bloody right there if not for the sudden thunder of hooves from the east end of town. A rider came galloping in hard, his bay mare dark with sweat, foam flying from her mouth. He pulled up in a spray of dust and practically threw himself out of the saddle, stumbling slightly before catching his balance. Mr. Holloway. The rider was young, maybe 20, with a sunburned face and wild eyes. The cattle? Sir, we found the cattle. Silence. Complete and total silence. The kind of silence that comes when the world stops making sense, when everything everyone thought they knew suddenly shifts beneath their feet. Garrett's face went through a rapid series of expressions, each one flickering past too fast to fully register. Confusion first, his brow furrowing, his mouth opening slightly. Then relief, his shoulders dropping, his eyes widening. And then, for just a fraction of a second, something darker, something that looked almost like fury, like rage at being interrupted, like anger at news that should have been good. Then it was gone, replaced by careful neutrality, his face going smooth and blank as creek stones. Jim caught it, though. Caught that flash of darkness. Filed it away to examine later. Where, Jesse? Garrett's voice was steady, controlled, but Jim could hear the strain beneath it, the tension of a man working hard to maintain composure. Box Canyon, sir, 2 miles past the North Ridge, right where it narrows down to that bottleneck. All 39 head of them, penned in with rope and brush. Someone built a makeshift corral, used mesquite branches and rope to block the canyon mouth. The cattle are thirsty and hungry, hungry, but they're all alive, every single one. We checked brands, they're all accounted for. The square erupted, people talking over each other, exclaiming, questioning, trying to make sense of what they just heard. Thank God. How did they get there? What does this mean? Who moved them? Why would anyone do that? Jim watched Garrett carefully, studying the older man's face like a card player, reading tells. And he saw it. Saw the way Garrett's eyes cut sharply to someone in the back of the crowd. Just for a moment. Just a flicker of eye contact. Jim followed that gaze and saw a young man standing apart from the others, pale as milk, looking like he'd just seen his own grave dug. The kid couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with the thin build of someone not quite finished growing. His hands were shaking. His face had gone from pale to gray. Samuel Brennan. Jim didn't know the name yet, but he'd remember that face. Garrett recovered quickly, his politician's instincts kicking in. A man didn't build a ranch and a reputation by falling apart when plans went wrong. Well, he said loudly, addressing the crowd, his voice carrying that same note of authority. This is unexpected. I'll grant you that. But it doesn't prove her innocence. She probably moved them there herself. Had help from those renegades I mentioned. Planned to come back later. Maybe tonight, maybe next week. Drive them across the border into Mexico and sell them when things cool down. Nolan made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor at all. When she spoke, her voice was stronger now, anger giving her energy. Sell them to who? I have no horse. I have no wagon. I live in a cave with a blanket and a cooking pot. Who would I sell to? How would I move them? Do you think I can fly like the hawk? Do you think I can make cattle walk through stone? The logic was devastating in its simplicity, cutting through Garrett's explanations like a knife through paper. Several people in the crowd nodded. The certainty that had held them together was beginning to crack, doubt seeping in through the fissures. Henry Cole shifted his weight uncomfortably. His wife, Rosemary, touched his arm and whispered something Jim couldn't hear. Reverend Wright took another step forward, his face deeply troubled now, his hands still clasped but his lips no longer moving. Jim pressed what he recognized as an advantage. Mr. Holloway, if the cattle were just moved in the last day or two, there'll be fresh tracks everywhere. A clear trail, 39 head of cattle and 2 horses don't move through rough country without leaving sign a blind man could follow. Maybe we should all ride out there and examine the evidence before we jump to any more conclusions. See what the ground has to tell us. It was a reasonable suggestion. More than reasonable. It was the obvious next step for anyone actually interested in justice rather than spectacle. Garrett's face flushed red, anger finally breaking through his controlled facade. Fine, fine, cut her loose if that's what you all want, but this doesn't prove a damn thing. Doesn't prove she's innocent. Just means we need to investigate further before we hand her over to Marshal Tanner tomorrow. He turned his glare on Nolan, all pretense of civility abandoned now. And you listen to me good. You should leave, tonight. Pack up whatever miserable possessions you have in that cave and get the hell out of this territory. Go to San Carlos where they're keeping the rest of your people. Go to Mexico. Go to hell for all I care. But if you're still in these hills come morning, you'll regret it. That's not a threat. That's a promise. Nayland met his eyes steadily, unflinching. When she spoke, her voice carried across the quiet square, clear and strong despite her cracked lips and parched throat. My people are dead. All of them. My husband is buried in the rocks above Canyon de los Embudos. My son is buried beside him. I put them in the ground with my own hands because there was no one else left to do it. The soldiers took everything, killed everyone. This land is all I have left of them. These hills hold their spirits. This is my home now. I have as much right to be here as you, as much right as anyone. Rights? Garrett's mask cracked completely, his face contorting with genuine hatred. You people lost your rights when you lost the war, when you murdered women and children, when you burned ranches and killed settlers and raided and stole for 50 years. Your people are savages. You're here because we allow it. We tolerate it. Don't you ever forget that. He spun on his heel and stalked away, his boots striking the ground hard with each step. His men followed, including the young one with Garrett's jaw who'd been ready to draw. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the show over, the excitement fading, everyone ready to get back to their interrupted day. But Jim noticed that the pale young man, Samuel Brennan, lingered at the edge of the square, lingered and watched Nalene with eyes that held something Jim couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or both. Jim knelt and pulled his pocket knife from his vest, opening the blade. It was a good knife, German steel, kept sharp enough to shave with. He cut the ropes binding Nayland's wrists with quick, efficient strokes, being careful not to nick her skin. The hemp parted with a series of soft sounds, and the rope fell away into the dust. Nalin brought her hands forward slowly, wincing as blood flow returned in painful rushes of sensation. The rope had cut deep, leaving raw wounds that would take days to heal. She flexed her fingers carefully, testing them, making sure nothing was broken. Her hands were small, but strong, the hands of someone who'd worked hard every day of her life. "You have somewhere safe to go?" Jim asked quietly. "I have been safe for 3 years without your help, cowboy." Nayland rubbed her wrists carefully, not looking at him, her voice flat. "Why did you do that? Why interfere?" "Seemed like the right thing to do." "The right thing?" She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away. Her eyes seemed to see through skin and bone to whatever was hiding underneath. "Men do not do the right thing. They do what benefits them." "So what do you want from me?" "Money? I have none. Land? I own nothing. My body? I would kill you first." "Nothing, ma'am. I don't want anything." "Everyone wants something." She stood slowly, her legs stiff from hours in the same position. Even standing, she barely came to his shoulder, maybe 5'2" at most. "Thank you for removing the sack. But I do not need rescue, I do not need protection, and I do not need pity from any white man." She turned to leave, heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open desert and scrub brush, and the long walk back to her cave in the hills. Jim almost let her go. Almost. He'd done what his conscience required. He'd stopped the immediate cruelty. He could walk away now with his honor intact, find a saloon, get a drink, ask about work, move on with his life. But he'd learned in 5 hard years that sometimes the right choice is the dangerous one, and something in the way that young man was watching her made the hair stand up on the back of Jim's neck. He reached out and touched her arm gently, barely a touch at all. "Ma'am, wait just a moment." Nalin went rigid. Every muscle in her body tensed like a steel spring compressed past its limit, like an animal caught in a trap with nowhere to run. Her hand moved toward the knife at her belt, a quick instinctive motion, but she stopped herself, forced herself to be still, forced herself to wait and see what this stranger wanted before she started cutting. Jim let go immediately, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Those cattle didn't pen themselves," he said quietly. "Someone moved them. Someone who had reason to want you blamed for it. And whoever that is, they're still out there, still have their reasons. You understand what I'm saying?" Nalin pulled her arm away, but she didn't walk off. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Before Jim could answer, a rock sailed through the air and struck Nalin's shoulder. Not hard, but hard enough to sting, hard enough to leave a bruise. They both turned. The same 3 boys from before stood at the edge of the square, emboldened by the smaller crowd, by the protection of distance, by the certainty that no one would stop them. Billy Meeks wound up for another throw. "Beast!" he shouted, his young voice cracking with excitement. "Go back to your cave, Apache." Another rock flew, this one bigger. Nalin's hand shot out and caught it midair, her reflexes sharp as a hawk taking a rabbit. For a moment, she just held it, her fingers white-knuckled around the stone. Then she threw it back, not at the boys, but at the ground near their feet, hard enough that it kicked up dust when it hit. The boys scattered like quail, laughing as they ran. That sound, that casual, thoughtless laughter, was somehow worse than hatred. Hatred at least acknowledged your humanity enough to fear it. "This is why I live alone," Nayland said quietly. Her face had gone carefully blank, but Jim could see the hurt in her eyes that no amount of pride could quite hide. "Even when they know I am innocent, even when the truth sits before them like the sun at noon, they will still see a beast. They will always see a beast, because that is easier than seeing a woman, easier than seeing a human being who hurts and bleeds and mourns. She walked away then, and this time Jim let her go. He watched her move through the dispersing crowd, spine straight, head up, refusing to show them any weakness even as blood dripped from her wrists. People gave her a wide berth, parents pulling children close as she passed, men turning their backs, women whispering behind their hands. The path opened before her like she carried plague. But Jim noticed something else that made his gut tighten with apprehension. That pale young man, Samuel Brennan, had started following her, keeping his distance, using the last few wagons and buildings for cover, but definitely following. Moving with the jerky, uncertain gait of someone who hadn't quite decided what they were going to do, but knew they were going to do something. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. His face carried the expression of a man about to make a terrible mistake. Jim glanced back at his horse. Dusty was still tied to the hitching post, patient and tired, needing water and feed and rest. Jim needed a drink and a hot meal and a bed that wasn't the ground. The smart thing would be to walk away, find the saloon, get information about work, mind his own business. His fingers touched the pocket watch through his vest. Honor above all. He'd failed that honor once with Mary. Let his sister die because he'd been too afraid of social conventions, too willing to believe it wasn't his business, too concerned with being polite and proper while a woman was beaten to death. He'd spent 5 years running from that failure, 5 years of drifting from town to town like a ghost afraid to haunt anywhere for long. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to stand still and face whatever came. Consequences be damned. Jim walked toward the livery stable at the north end of town, leading Dusty by the reins. But his eyes never left Samuel Brennan, slipping between buildings like a man with secrets and bad intentions. Following the Apache woman who'd just been declared a beast. The afternoon sun beat down on Red Mesa with relentless fury, heat rising in waves from the hard-packed earth. The town smelled of horses and dust and human sweat and the faint copper tang of blood in the dirt where Nolan had bled. In the distance, Devil's Spine Ridge rose against the sky like the broken backbone of some ancient creature God had abandoned halfway through creation. And somewhere up in those hills, a woman who'd lost everything was walking into danger she didn't even know was following her. Jim handed Dusty's reins to the stable boy, a gap-toothed kid, maybe 14, with dirt under his fingernails and hay in his hair. Water first, then feed. Oats if you have them, hay if you don't. Give him a good rub down. I'll be back for him in an hour or so. Yes, sir, that'll be 2 bits for stabling, another quarter if you want the oats. Jim flipped him a $50. Keep the change. And if anyone asks, you haven't seen me. The boy's eyes widened at the unexpected generosity and the even more unexpected request, but he nodded and led Dusty into the shadowed interior of the stable. Jim waited until they were out of sight, then turned and walked quickly but unhurriedly back the way he'd come, his hand resting easy on his gun belt, his eyes scanning the spaces between buildings where Samuel Brennan had disappeared. He found the trail easily enough. The kid had left a path a child could follow, broken twigs and disturbed dust and the heel prints of someone moving fast without worrying about sign. Jim followed at a distance, keeping buildings and wagon beds between himself and his quarry, an old skill from a younger life when he'd tracked cattle thieves with his father. Nolan was already at the edge of town, walking steadily toward the open desert, her buckskin dress dark with sweat, her long black hair loose now and hanging past her shoulders. Samuel was maybe 200 feet behind her, moving faster, closing the distance. Jim kept his distance and followed them both into the wilderness beyond Red Mesa, into a land of saguaro cactus and ocotillo and ancient stones that had witnessed 10,000 years of blood and survival. The hunt was on, and Jim Crawford, for the first time in 5 years, felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. He was going to make sure that woman didn't die alone in the desert. He was going to stand between her and whoever wanted her dead, even if it meant standing against the whole damn town. Honor above all, his father's words, his family's creed, the promise he'd broken once and sworn never to break again. The beast had a protector now, whether she wanted one or not. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of dust and stone, shimmering in the afternoon heat. Jim kept his distance, moving from one patch of cover to the next, using the ancient skills his grandfather had taught him during long summers, tracking Comanche raiders across the Texas plains. Watch the horizon, not your feet. Move when the wind moves. Let the land hide you. Samuel Brennan was easier to follow than a drunk steer, crashing through creosote bushes and kicking up small avalanches of scree as he hurried after Nolan's retreating figure. The woman moved differently. She placed each step with deliberate care, her moccasined feet finding solid ground instinctively, leaving barely a trace of her passage. Even injured, even exhausted, she moved like smoke across the landscape. Jim recognized the gait of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to survive in country that killed the careless. A quarter mile from town, where the last scattered adobes gave way to true wilderness, Samuel called out, "Hey, you need to stop!" Nayland turned, and even from 100 feet away, Jim could see her body shift into a defensive stance. Not aggressive exactly, but ready, the way a cougar looks when cornered, dangerous despite the size. "Leave me alone," she said. Her voice carried clearly in the desert stillness. Samuel closed the distance, his boots sliding on loose gravel, his breathing already labored from exertion and nerves. He stopped about 10 feet from her, one hand on his belt near his knife. "I can't. You need to leave tonight. Don't come back to Red Mesa. Don't come anywhere near this territory. Just go." "Why?" Nayland studied him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Why do you care where I go?" Samuel glanced back toward town, checking to see if anyone had followed. He didn't spot Jim crouched behind a tumble of boulders 30 yards to the south. "Because if you don't leave, something bad will happen to you. Worse than what happened today. Much worse." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. Please, you have to understand. Just take what you need and run. Go north. Go south. I don't care. Just get out of this territory before it's too late." Nayland took a step toward him instead of away, her chin lifted, her scarred face fierce despite the dried blood on her wrists. "You know something about the cattle, about who moved them." Samuel flinched like she'd struck him. "I don't know anything about that." "You are lying." Another step closer. "You were in the crowd. I saw your face when the rider brought news. You looked like a man who had seen death coming. You know who moved those cattle. You know Wawam." "You're wrong. I don't know anything." "Then why are you here?" She was close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. "Why follow me into the desert to warn me? Why do you look like you have not slept since those cattle were found?" Samuel's hand tightened on his knife, knuckles going white. He pulled it halfway from its sheath, then stopped, the blade catching sunlight. He wasn't threatening her, Jim realized. He was holding on to something solid because everything else in his world was falling apart. Jim rose from behind the rocks. "Garrett, well, what?" Samuel spun around, the knife now fully drawn, his young face white with terror. When he saw Jim standing there, calm and still as a fence post, the boy nearly dropped the weapon. Why are you following me?" Jim walked forward slowly, hands visible and empty, his voice level and unthreatening. "Same reason you're following her, except I'm not carrying a knife." "I wasn't going to hurt her. I just needed to warn her, to make her understand that she has to leave before—" "Before what, son? Before Garrett does what?" Samuel looked between them, trapped, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. The knife trembled in his grip. "I can't say anything. If I tell you, if anyone finds out I talked, Garrett will destroy my family. My father works for him, Thomas Brennan. He's been foreman at the Holloway Ranch for 12 years. If I cross Garrett, he'll fire my father. We'll lose our house, our income, everything. My mother's sick. She needs medicine. We can't afford to make him angry. And if Nolan dies because you stayed silent," Jim let the question hang in the desert air. "If she ends up with a bullet in her back or her throat cut, and you have to live the rest of your life knowing you could have prevented it, you think that weight gets lighter with time? I'm here to tell you it doesn't. It gets heavier every single day until you can barely stand up under it." Something in Jim's voice, some deep well of pain and regret, reached the younger man. Samuel's shoulders sagged, the knife lowered. "I didn't want any of this. I swear to God, I didn't want any part of it." "Then tell us what happened," Jim said gently. Samuel looked around the empty desert as if expecting Garrett to materialize from the heat shimmer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My mother needs medicine. Laudanum for the pain. She's got cancer, the doctor says. In her stomach. Nothing anyone can do but make her comfortable until the end. Laudanum costs money we don't have. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dust across his face. 3 weeks ago, Garrett called me into his office, said he had a job for me. Easy work, he said. Good pay. $50 just for moving some cattle from one pasture to another. He said it was a surprise for the other ranchers, some kind of joke to teach them a lesson about watching their herds more carefully. But it wasn't a joke, Nayland said quietly. Samuel shook his head miserably. I didn't know that at first. I swear, I thought it was just rich men playing pranks on each other. Garrett said to move the cattle to Box Canyon at night, pen them in with brush and rope, and keep quiet about it. Said after a few days, when everyone was worried, he'd find them and be the hero. I needed the money so bad, I didn't ask questions. When did you realize it was more than that? Jim asked. 2 days ago, when his men grabbed Nayland and dragged her into town. When I saw them put that sack over her head and tie her up like an animal. Samuel's voice cracked. Garrett pulled me aside while everyone was gathering. He told me if I said one word, if I breathed one syllable about what I'd done, he'd make sure my father never worked in this territory again. Said he'd spread word that Thomas Brennan was a drunk and a thief. Said my mother would die without medicine, and it would be my fault. But you came to warn her anyway, Jim observed, because I'm not a murderer. I made a stupid mistake for stupid money, but I won't be part of killing someone. I won't carry that. Jim studied the boy for a long moment. Samuel Brennan was weak, yes, easily manipulated, yes, but not evil. There was a difference, and Jim had learned to recognize it. Why does Garrett want her blamed? What's his real purpose in all this? Samuel took a shaky breath. He's losing money, bad investments. There's a man back east, in Boston. Cornelius Thorne. Garrett borrowed $18,000 from him 2 years ago to invest in a silver mine near Prescott. The mine collapsed, literally collapsed. Cave-in killed 16 men and buried the silver veins so deep they'd have to dig for years to reach it again. Garrett lost everything. $18,000, Jim said softly. It was a staggering sum, a working man's wages for 30 years. Thorne isn't the kind of man who forgives debt, Samuel continued. He's connected to some kind of criminal organization back east, the kind that makes people disappear. He sent Garrett letters. I saw them. They said if the debt wasn't paid by the end of September, Thorne's men would come for Garrett's family, his wife Margaret, his daughters Sarah and Elizabeth. The letters were very specific about what would happen to them. Nalin made a soft sound of understanding. So he planned to steal his own cattle, collect insurance money, also sell the cattle to someone across the border. Exactly, Samuel said. The insurance would pay out $800 for the reported losses, and he'd already arranged to sell the cattle to a buyer in Sonora for another $400. $1,200 total. Not enough to cover the whole debt, but enough to buy time, to negotiate, to keep his family safe a little longer. But the cattle were found too soon, Jim said, before he could move them to Mexico. Yes, one of Henry Cole's ranch hands was riding fence along the northern boundary. Saw buzzards circling Box Canyon and went to investigate, thinking maybe a cow had fallen and broken a leg. Found all the cattle instead. When Jesse came riding in with that news, I thought Garrett was going to have a heart attack right there in the square. Jim's mind was working through the implications. So now he's desperate. The insurance won't pay because the cattle weren't actually stolen. The buyer in Sonora won't pay because Garrett doesn't have the cattle to sell. He's got 2 weeks until Thorne's deadline and no way to get the money. Worse than that, Samuel said, Garrett has already spent some of the money he was counting on getting. Bought new equipment for the ranch on credit, figuring he'd pay it off when the insurance came through. Now he owes money to the bank in Tucson, too. He's drowning in debt, and he can see his family's death sentence getting closer every day, which makes him more dangerous than a cornered rattlesnake, Jim said. A desperate man will do things a sane man wouldn't consider. This morning, Samuel said, his voice dropping even lower, I overheard him talking to Wade, his nephew. He told Wade that if Nellen didn't leave town on her own, they'd have to arrange an accident. Make it look like she fell from the rocks in Devil's Spine Ridge or got attacked by a mountain lion. Something that would get rid of the only witness who could contradict his story about Apache raiders. I am not a witness, Nayland said. I know nothing about who moved the cattle. Doesn't matter, Jim said grimly. You're a scapegoat. As long as you're alive and in these hills, people will wonder. They'll ask questions. Some of them are already doubting Garrett's story, but if you're dead, he can tell whatever tale he wants, and there's no one to contradict him. Silence settled over them like dust. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals, hunting for prey in the scrubland below. In the distance, a dust devil spun across the desert floor, a column of wind and sand dancing briefly before collapsing. There must be proof, Nayland said finally. These letters you saw, this debt, there must be evidence. There is, Samuel said. Garrett keeps a ledger in his office at the ranch. The real accounts, not the ones he shows to the bank or the tax assessor. It shows everything. The losses from the silver mine, the debt to Thorne, the planned insurance fraud, even some letters from Thorne detailing the threats. Garrett keeps them as leverage in case Thorne ever tries to double-cross him. Jim felt a plan beginning to form. Where exactly is this office? Main house, ground floor, western corner. There's a window that faces the creek bed that runs behind the property, but you can't be thinking of breaking in. The ranch is guarded at night. At least 3 men, plus Garrett and Wade, sleep in the main house. You'd never get in undetected. Nearly impossible is different from impossible, Nayland said. There was something dangerous in her voice now, something that had been tempered in fire and hardened by survival. And I know every inch of this territory, including ways onto that ranch that Garrett's men do not watch. Jim looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since removing the sack. Small and scarred and bleeding, but absolutely unbroken. There was steel in this woman. The kind of steel that didn't bend. You're thinking of going there, Jim said. Tonight. I'm tired of running, Nayland said simply. 3 years I have run. From soldiers, from settlers, from hatred and fear, and people who want me dead just for existing. I ran when my husband died. Ran when my son died. Ran when my people died. I will not run anymore. If Samuel is willing to testify about what Garrett did, then I am willing to get the proof we need. It's too dangerous, Jim said, though he already knew what her answer would be. Everything about my life is dangerous, cowboy. Every morning I wake up might be the morning someone decides to kill me. Every time I come to town for supplies might be the time they hang me from a tree. Danger is my constant companion. At least this time I choose to face it instead of waiting for it to find me. Jim studied her face, seeing the determination there, seeing something else too, a kind of fierce joy at the prospect of fighting back instead of hiding. He understood that feeling, understood it deeply. Then I'm coming with you, he said. Why? You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Maybe that's exactly why, because I don't owe you anything, which means I'm choosing this freely. And I'm tired of watching from the sidelines while bad things happen to good people. Samuel looked between them like he was watching a runaway wagon heading for a cliff and couldn't figure out how to stop it. This is insane. Even if you get the ledger, Garrett will just say you stole it. Say you forged the entries. It'll be your word against his, and everyone in Red Mesa trusts Garrett Holloway. Not everyone, Jim said. Reverend Wright looked troubled today. So did Henry Cole's wife. And Henry himself couldn't meet anyone's eyes when Garrett was talking. There are cracks in Garrett's support. We just need to widen them. But first, we need evidence that can't be explained away. If I testify, Samuel said slowly, if I tell people what Garrett paid me to do, that's evidence too. Corroboration. They won't believe you over him, Nayland said bluntly. You are a boy. He is a man of power and respect. They will say you are lying to protect me, or that you are confused, or that I seduced you somehow, used Apache witchcraft to cloud your mind. She's right, Jim said. We need the ledger. We need Garrett's own handwriting proving his debts and his scheme. Then your testimony becomes confirmation instead of accusation. It's the difference between a story and proof. Samuel nodded slowly, his young face aged by the weight of his decision. Okay, I'll help however I can. But we need to move fast. Garrett's not stupid. He knows I was acting strange in the square. He might suspect I'll talk. We should do this tonight before he has time to move the ledger or destroy it. Tonight then, Jim agreed. But you're not coming with us. You're going to stay in town and act normal. Go to the saloon, have a drink, play cards, be seen. We need you to have an alibi so Garrett can't claim you were part of the break-in. But if something goes wrong, if you need help, if something goes wrong, you ride to get Marshal Tanner. Tell him everything. Make sure the truth gets out even if we don't make it back. The reality of what they were planning settled over Samuel like a shroud. You're really going to do this. Break into Garrett Holloway's ranch, steal his private ledger, risk getting shot for a woman you met 3 hours ago. That about covers it, Jim said. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. Can it be both? Despite everything, Samuel almost smiled. Then his face went serious again. There's one more thing you should know. Garrett's nephew, Wade, he's killed men before. At least 2 that I know of. Drifters who tried to rob the ranch last year. He didn't just shoot them, he made it slow. Made them suffer. He's not like Garrett. Garrett's cruel when he needs to be, but Wade enjoys it. If he catches you, he won't just shoot you and be done with it. Noted, Jim said. Now get back to town before someone notices you're gone. Remember, act normal. Drink, play cards, talk about the weather. Don't mention seeing us or talking to us. And Samuel, what you're doing here, choosing to help despite the cost, that takes courage, real courage. Remember that when things get hard. Samuel nodded, swallowed hard, and started back toward town. He walked like a man heading to his own execution, shoulders hunched, feet dragging. But he was going. That was what mattered. When he was out of earshot, Nayland turned to Jim. You do not have to do this. This is my fight, my life that Garrett threatens. Seems like it became my fight the moment I took that sack off your head, Jim said. Besides, you'll need someone to keep watch while you're inside, and I'm a fair hand with a rifle if things go sideways. You realize if we are caught, they will hang you. Even if we survive the night, even if we escape, you will be a wanted man. Your life will be over. Jim touched the pocket watch in his vest. My life's been over for 5 years. I've just been going through the motions. Maybe it's time to start living again, even if it's only for one more night. They looked at each other across 3 feet of desert sand. 2 broken people with nothing left to lose. 2 survivors who'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop running is to turn and fight. We will need a plan, Nayland said. The ranch is large. The guards are armed. We cannot simply walk in. Then we don't walk, we crawl. You said you know ways onto the property that aren't watched. There is a creek bed, runs behind the ranch. Dry most of the year, but deep enough to hide a person. The banks are 8 feet high in places. If we move carefully, we can get close to the main house without being seen. What about the guards? 3 men, Samuel said. 2 at the main gate, 1 circling the corrals. They change shifts every 4 hours. The next change will be at 8 o'clock tonight. Jim pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. 3:15. They had less than 5 hours to prepare. Where's your camp? We need somewhere to wait until dark. Follow me. Nayland led him west toward Devil's Spine Ridge, moving faster now that they were away from the town and watching eyes. She walked with the efficient stride of someone who'd learned to cover ground without wasting energy. Jim followed, leading Dusty by the reins. He'd retrieved the horse from the livery while Samuel was talking, giving the stable boy an extra $1 to forget he'd ever seen anyone. The country grew rougher as they climbed, loose rock and scattered boulders, dry washes and stands of ocotillo that reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The afternoon heat beat down with physical force. Jim's shirt was soaked through with sweat. His mouth felt like it was full of cotton. But Nayland didn't slow down, didn't look back, just kept climbing. After 45 minutes, they reached a narrow canyon cut deep into the ridge, hidden from below by an outcrop of red sandstone. Nayland led them through a gap barely wide enough for Dusty to squeeze through, then up a steep path that switchbacked along the canyon wall. At the top was a shallow cave, maybe 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. tucked under an overhang that protected it from rain and view. This was where she'd lived for 3 years. The camp was sparse, Spartan. A thin blanket spread on the sandy floor, a fire pit near the mouth of the cave with a small stack of wood, a cooking pot, dented and blackened, a water bag made from a deer stomach hanging from a rock protrusion to keep it cool, a bow and quiver of arrows leaning against the wall, 2 knives, one for fighting and one for skinning, a leather pouch that probably held flint and steel, some dried meat hanging from a cord stretched across the cave's mouth. That was it. That was everything she owned in the world, everything she'd managed to salvage from the ruins of her people. "This is your home," Jim said quietly. "It keeps the rain off. That is all home means now." Jim unsaddled Dusty and rubbed the horse down with handfuls of dry grass. Nolan watched him work, her eyes assessing, judging his competence. When he was finished, she gestured for him to sit. "Your wrists," Jim said. "We should clean those cuts before they get infected." Nolan hesitated, then nodded. She sat across the cold fire pit from him while he pulled out his canteen and a relatively clean bandana from his saddlebag. He poured water over the fabric and gently cleaned the rope burns on her wrists. The wounds were deep, still oozing blood in places. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched his face while he worked. "You have done this before," she said. "Doctored rope burns? More times than I can count. Comes with ranch work." "No, I mean help someone who could not help themselves. This is not the first time you have done this." Jim's hands paused in their work. "What makes you say that?" "The way you moved in the square. You were not thinking about what to do. You were remembering what you failed to do before. There is a difference." It was unsettling how clearly she saw him. "I had a sister," Jim said after a moment. "Younger. Her husband beat her. Everyone knew. Everyone saw. Nobody did anything, including me. Said it was family business. Said it wasn't our place to interfere. Until one day he killed her. And then you killed him." It wasn't a question. Jim finished wrapping her wrists with strips torn from his bandana. "Yes." "Good," Nayland said simply. "Some men deserve killing." They sat in silence for a while. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the canyon floor. A raven called somewhere in the rocks, its voice harsh and lonely. "Tell me about your husband," Jim said. "And your son, if you want to." Nayland was quiet for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice soft with memory and pain. "Tarak was a warrior, not the best fighter, not the fastest runner, but brave, so brave. When the soldiers came to our camp at dawn, he could have run, should have run. Instead, he stood between them and Ashki, our son, 6 years old, just a baby still. The soldiers told us we had 10 minutes to gather what we could carry. Anyone who resisted would be shot." She stared into the empty fire pit as if seeing flames there. "Tarak said no, said we would not leave our home, said this land belonged to us, given by the spirits, and no white man had the right to take it. The lieutenant said he was a hostile, said hostiles were to be dealt with accordingly. He shot Tarak in the chest. One shot. My husband fell in the dirt. A single tear tracked down her scarred cheek. Ashki screamed, ran to his father. I tried to grab him, tried to pull him back, but he was so fast, so small. He knelt beside Tarak and put his little hands on the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Crying, calling for help. The lieutenant said the boy was contaminated. Said he'd grow up to be a hostile like his father. He put his rifle to Ashki's head and pulled the trigger." Jim felt something break inside his chest. Jesus Christ. "I ran," Nayland said. "I heard my son calling for me. Calling Shima, Shima, which means mother. I heard him dying, and I ran into the trees like a coward. Hid in the rocks while they killed everyone else. When I came back, all I found were bodies. I buried Tarak and Ashki with my own hands, dug graves in the hard ground with a broken shovel, covered them with stones to keep the coyotes away." "That's not cowardice," Jim said. "That's survival. You had no weapon, no way to fight. If you'd stayed, you'd be dead too. Then why do I feel like I died anyway? Why do I wake up every morning wishing I had stayed, wishing I had died with them instead of living like this, alone and hated and called beast. Because love doesn't die when people do. It stays with us, becomes part of us. The pain proves we love them. Without the pain, they'd truly be gone. Nalin looked at him with those dark, depthless eyes. You understand this. You carry your own ghosts. Every damn day. Then why do you help me? Why risk your life for a stranger when you could not save your own sister? Because I can't save Mary. She's gone. But maybe I can save you. Maybe if I do this right, if I stand up instead of standing aside, I can look at myself in a mirror again without seeing a coward. You are not a coward, James Crawford. It was the first time she'd used his name. He hadn't realized she'd heard it. How did you know my name? Samuel said it when he was talking. You were too focused on his words to notice. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent. Finally, Nalin stood and walked to the back of the cave. She returned with a small leather bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a buckskin dress, different from the one she wore. This one was beautiful. Intricate beadwork in blue and white decorated the yoke. Fringe hung from the sleeves and hem. It had been made with love and skill. This was for ceremonies, Nalin said quietly, for important occasions. My mother made it for me. I have not worn it since she died 10 years ago. But tonight, if I am to risk everything, if I am to fight back instead of hide, I will honor her memory by wearing it. She disappeared deeper into the cave to change. When she emerged, Jim's breath caught. Not because she looked beautiful, though she did, but because she looked like herself, like the woman she'd been before loss and exile had tried to erase her. The beadwork caught the fading light. The fringe swayed as she moved. She'd braided her hair and tied it with a strip of red cloth. My people believed that how you dressed for battle mattered, she said, that wearing the symbols of your ancestors gave you their strength. I do not know if this is true, but it cannot hurt. You look like a warrior, Jim said. I am a warrior. Tonight they will remember this. As darkness fell, they prepared. Jim checked his weapons. The Winchester was loaded, 15 rounds in the magazine. The Colt held 6 rounds, one chamber left empty under the hammer for safety. He had maybe 30 extra cartridges in his gun belt. Not enough for a war, but enough for what he hoped would be a quiet break-in. Nalin sharpened her knives on a whetstone, the sound of steel on stone ringing softly in the cave. She tested her bow, pulling the sinew string back to check the tension. Her arrows were tipped with metal points, probably salvaged from somewhere. She moved through these preparations with ritualistic care, each action deliberate. We should eat, she said. Fighting on an empty stomach is foolish. She brought out some of the dried meat, tough strips of venison that required serious chewing. Jim pulled hardtack and jerky from his saddlebag. They ate in silence, washing the food down with water from Nalin's deer stomach bag. It was the worst meal Jim had eaten in weeks, and the best at the same time, because he wasn't eating alone. When the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear in the vast darkness above, they set out. Jim left Dusty tied in the canyon with enough slack to graze. If they didn't come back, the horse would eventually work himself free and find his way to water. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, Nalin leading, Jim following. She navigated by starlight and memory, never hesitating, her feet finding safe paths through treacherous terrain. Jim had done plenty of night riding in his life, but he'd never seen anyone move through darkness like this woman did. She seemed to sense obstacles before they appeared, flowing around boulders and cactus like water finding its course. An hour of careful walking brought them to the northern edge of Garrett's property. They crouched behind a low rise, studying the ranch below. The main house was lit, warm yellow light spilling from windows. The bunkhouse showed fewer lights. The barn was dark. 2 men stood by the main gate, maybe 200 yards away, their cigarettes glowing red in the darkness. They were talking, relaxed, not expecting trouble. The creek bed is there, Nalin whispered, pointing to a dark line that cut across the property. We go down into it upstream, then follow it to the house. Stay low. Move only when I move. Stop when I stop. Understand? Understood. They descended into the creek bed, their boots finding purchase on the steep bank. The bottom was dry sand and smooth stones, easy walking. The banks rose 8 feet on either side, high enough to hide them completely. They moved in single file, Nayland ahead, Jim 10 feet behind. Both of them crouched low despite the cover. Progress was slow. Nellen would advance 20 feet, pause, listen, then motion for Jim to follow. They moved in these careful increments, covering maybe 50 yards every 5 minutes. Jim's legs began to ache from the constant crouch, his back protesting the unnatural position. But he didn't complain, didn't make a sound. They were 50 yards from the house when Nayland froze. Jim stopped instantly, going completely still. Footsteps above them on the creek bank. Someone walking patrol. Heavy boots on packed earth. The sound grew closer, peaked directly above them, then faded as the guard continued his circuit. They waited 2 full minutes after the footsteps faded before moving again. When they reached the point closest to the house, Nalin held up her hand, then pointed up. This was where they'd leave the creek bed. They scrambled up the bank on the house side, their heads barely clearing the rim. 30 feet of open ground separated them from the back wall. 30 feet of moonlit earth where they'd be completely exposed if anyone looked their way. Nalin counted silently, her lips moving, watching the guard's pattern. When she reached 10, she moved. Fast and low, covering the distance in seconds. Jim followed, his heart hammering. They reached the wall and pressed against it, breathing hard, listening for shouts or gunfire. Nothing. Only the sound of wind and the distant lowing of cattle. The window Samuel had mentioned was 10 feet to their right, a simple frame with glass panes. Locked, almost certainly. Nalin pulled her skinning knife and worked the thin blade into the gap between window and frame, feeling for the latch. The wood was old, swollen with age and moisture. She applied pressure carefully, trying not to make noise. The latch gave with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet night. They both froze, waiting. Still nothing. Nayland eased the window open. It moved smoothly, recently oiled. They climbed through into darkness. Jim's boots hit carpet, thick, expensive. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Moonlight filtered through the window, providing just enough illumination to see shapes. A desk, chairs, shelves lined with books. This was Garrett's office, his private sanctuary. Nayland moved to the desk while Jim positioned himself by the door, listening for movement in the house. He could hear voices somewhere distant, probably the main living area. Male voices, talking and laughing. Garrett and Wade having an evening drink, confident in their power, unaware that thieves were in their house. Nayland tried the desk drawer. Locked. She pulled her knife again and worked it into the lock mechanism, feeling for the tumbler. This took longer. Jim watched the door, his hand on his Colt, every nerve screaming. Seconds felt like hours. Click. The lock gave way. Nalin opened the drawer slowly, the wood making a soft sliding sound. Inside were papers, a cash box, a revolver, and a brown leather ledger. She pulled the ledger out and opened it to a random page. Even in the dim light, Jim could see columns of numbers. Income, expenses, debts, all in Garrett's precise handwriting. They had it. They had the proof. That's when they heard boots in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. Jim and Nayland looked at each other in the darkness, both knowing they were out of time. The door was 15 feet away. The window was 10 feet away. They could try for either, but not both. And whoever was in the hallway was between them and escape. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A hand touched the knob, started to turn it. Jim made a decision. He grabbed the oil lamp from the desk and hurled it against the far wall. Glass shattered. Oil splashed across the wallpaper. The flame from the wick caught instantly, spreading like liquid fire. The door flew open. Garrett stood there, Wade behind him with a rifle. They both stared at the spreading flames, momentarily shocked. That moment was enough. Nalin threw herself at Garrett, her small body hitting his midsection like a cannonball. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Jim charged Wade, grabbing the rifle barrel and forcing it up just as it discharged. The bullet punched through the ceiling, raining plaster dust. The ranch erupted in case and flame and violence, and Jim Crawford, for the first time in 5 years, felt truly alive. Fire spread across the office wall with terrifying speed, the oil-soaked wallpaper igniting like kindling. The flames cast wild, dancing shadows across the room, turning everything into a nightmare of lighted and dark. Smoke began to fill the air, thick and acrid, burning Jim's throat with each breath. Jim wrestled with Wade for control of the rifle, their bodies crashing into the bookshelf behind them. Books and papers cascaded down, some of them catching fire as they fell. Wade was younger, maybe 28, and strong from ranch work. But Jim had 15 years of hard living behind him and desperation fueling his strength. He drove his knee into Wade's stomach, heard the whoosh of air leaving the younger man's lungs, then twisted the rifle free and swung the stock hard into Wade's temple. Wade dropped like a stone. Across the room, Nayland and Garrett grappled on the carpet. Despite being half his size, she fought with a ferocity that came from 3 years of survival and a lifetime of having nothing left to lose. She'd gotten her knife out and slashed at him, opening a cut across his forearm. Garrett roared with pain and rage, his hand closing around her throat. Jim didn't think. He just moved, grabbed Garrett by the collar and hauled him backward with all his strength. Garrett flew across the room and slammed into the desk. Nayland rolled away, gasping, her hands at her throat. "The ledger!" Jim shouted over the roar of the flames. "Where is it?" Nayland pointed. The brown leather book had fallen near the fire, pages beginning to curl from the heat. Jim lunged for it, grabbed it, pulled it away from the flames just as the corner started to smolder. He beat out the ember with his hand. "Fire!" Someone was shouting from outside. "Fire at the main house!" Boots pounded on the wooden floors. Men were coming, drawn by the gunshot and the smoke, now pouring from the window. Jim looked at Nayland. She looked at him. They were trapped. The door led into the house where Garrett's men were converging. The window led to open ground where they'd be shot before they made 10 feet. Then a voice cut through the chaos from the hallway. "Stop! Everyone freeze right now!" Marshal Jacob Tanner stood in the doorway, his Colt drawn, his weathered face grim in the firelight. Behind him stood Samuel Brennan, his young face terrified but determined. And behind Samuel, holding a lantern, stood Reverend Wright. "What the hell is going on here?" Tanner demanded. Garrett climbed to his feet, his face contorted with rage and the beginning of fear. "Marshal, thank God you're here. These two broke into my home, assaulted me and my nephew, tried to rob me. You see what they've done? They've set my house on fire." "That's not what Samuel told me," Tanner said, his gun still level, pointed at no one specifically but ready to target anyone. "He said you've been running a fraud scheme, stealing your own cattle, framing Nolan, planning to murder her to cover it up." The boy's confused. He doesn't know what he's saying. I should have known better than to trust him with anything important. His father's a drunk and the son's not much better. "My father is not a drunk," Samuel's voice cracked with anger. "He's worked for you for 12 years, and you've never said a word against him until now." "Mr. Holloway," by Reverend Wright spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "I've known you for 8 years, built this church with your donations, baptized your daughters. I've tried to see the good in you. But Samuel came to me tonight with a terrible story about debt and desperation and sin, about innocent blood you plan to shed. Tell me it's not true. Look me in the eye and tell me you haven't been planning to murder this woman." Garrett's mouth opened and closed. For the first time since Jim had met him, the man looked uncertain, looked trapped. "We have proof," Jim said, holding up the ledger. "Right here. Garrett's own handwriting. Shows his debt to Cornelius Thorne. Shows the silver mine losses. Shows the whole scheme. That's my private property. You have no right to it." "Marshal," Jim said, ignoring Garrett, "I'm willing to surrender myself for breaking and entering. But first, I ask you to examine this ledger. See for yourself what kind of man Garrett Holloway really is." Tanner's eyes flicked to the spreading flames. "We can discuss this after we get this fire under control. Everyone out, now, before this whole house burns down." Men were already arriving with buckets of water, forming a chain from the well. They pushed past the confrontation, focused on saving the structure. The fire had spread to the curtains now, climbing toward the ceiling. Smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. They all stumbled out into the hallway, then out the front door into the cool night air. Ranch hands ran in every direction, shouting, organizing, fighting the fire. In the chaos, Jim stayed close to Nayland, and Tanner kept his gun ready, his eyes sharp. They gathered in the yard away from the house. Garrett stood with Wade, who'd regained consciousness but looked unsteady. Jim and Nayland stood together. Samuel hovered near Reverend Wright, as if the old preacher's presence offered protection. "All right," Tanner said, "let's see this ledger." Jim handed it over. Tanner opened it, angling the pages to catch the light from the burning house. His face darkened as he read, his jaw tightening with each entry he scanned. Actual income, $2,400. Reported income, 5 he read aloud. Silver mine investment, minus $12,000. Debt to C. Thorne, Boston, $18,000. Due September 30th, 1886. He looked up at Garrett. "This is fraud, multiple counts, and these letters." He pulled out several papers tucked into the ledger's back pages. "If payment is not received by month's end, I will send men to collect from your family. Your wife and daughters will pay for your failures. Signed, Cornelius Thorne." "That ledger is private business." Garrett's voice had lost its authority, becoming shrill. "It's not evidence of anything, just personal accounts." "Personal accounts that show you falsified tax records," Tanner said. "Personal accounts that show motive for insurance fraud. Personal accounts that show why you'd want someone to blame for cattle theft that never happened." He turned to Samuel. "Tell me exactly what he paid you to do." Samuel's voice shook but held steady. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Holloway paid me $50 to move cattle from his pasture and from Henry Cole's and Caleb Morrison's ranches to Box Canyon. Told me it was a prank. I didn't know he was planning to blame Nolan until I saw them drag her into town with that sack over her head. Yesterday, I heard him tell Wade they'd have to arrange an accident for her if she didn't leave on her own. "That's a lie!" Garrett turned on Samuel with fury. "You ungrateful little bastard! After everything I've done for your family." "Everything you've done?" Samuel's fear was burning away, replaced by righteous anger. "You threatened to destroy us if I didn't help you. You used my mother's illness to manipulate me. You were going to let an innocent woman die to cover your crimes." "Innocent?" Garrett spun toward Nayland, his face twisted with hate. "She's Apache. Her people murdered settlers for 50 years, raided and killed and burned. She doesn't deserve justice or mercy or anything but a rope." "She deserves the same justice any American citizen deserves," Reverend Wright said quietly. "The same justice you claim to uphold. Or have you forgotten the words you speak every Sunday in church? Judge not, lest ye be judged. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Don't quote scripture at me, Reverend. I've done more for this town than any man alive. I built the church, funded the school, gave jobs to half the families in Red Mesa. And that gives you the right to commit fraud? Tanner's voice was cold as winter steel. The right to frame an innocent woman? The right to plan murder? A crowd was gathering now. The fire was under control, contained to Garrett's office, and people were starting to notice the confrontation in the yard. Henry Cole arrived, his wife Rosemary beside him. Caleb Morrison came from the direction of his ranch, drawn by the smoke and commotion. Others followed, townspeople who'd seen the flames and come to help. "What's happening here?" Henry demanded. Tanner held up the ledger. "Garrett Holloway has been defrauding the tax assessor, falsifying his accounts. He's $18,000 in debt to a criminal organization back east. He planned to steal his own cattle, collect insurance money, and blame Nolan for the theft. When the cattle were found too soon, he decided to murder her to keep his scheme from unraveling." A collective gasp ran through the gathering crowd. Henry's face went white. Rosemary's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb Morrison's expression turned from shock to fury. "That's all lies." Garrett's voice was desperate now, all pretense of control gone. "They're trying to frame me, puppy, the Apache witch, and this drifter, and that fool boy. They broke into my home, assaulted me, set my house on fire." "We broke in," Jim admitted. "I won't deny that. But we didn't assault anyone until Wade came at us with a rifle. And the fire was an accident. I knocked over a lamp trying to escape." "Convenient story," Garrett sneered. "Mr. Holloway," Rosemary Cole spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "I saw what you did today, putting that sack over her head, parading her through town like an animal. I've been married to Henry for 32 years, and I've never been ashamed of him until today, when he stood there and let that happen, when we all let that happen. She's right, another voice called out. Jim turned to see a woman he recognized from the square, the one who'd pulled her children away. We should be ashamed. All of us. We watched cruelty and called it justice. This doesn't change what she is. Garrett was losing ground, losing support, and he knew it. His voice had become pleading. She's Apache. Her people are savages, raiders, murderers. Her people are dead, Reverend Wright said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Killed by our army, her husband murdered in front of her, her 6-year-old son shot in cold blood. She's been living in a cave for 3 years, alone, trying to survive. And we repaid her suffering with more cruelty. We should all be on our knees begging forgiveness. I won't beg forgiveness from an animal. The words hung in the air. The crowd reacted, murmurs of disapproval spreading like ripples in water. Even some of Garrett's own ranch hands looked uncomfortable. Marshal Tanner closed the ledger with a definitive snap. Garrett Holloway, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder. Wade Holloway, you're under arrest as an accessory. You can't do this, Garrett said, but his voice had lost all power. You can't arrest me based on a stolen ledger, in the word of a scared boy. I can, and I am. The ledger shows clear evidence of tax fraud and motive. Samuel's testimony provides context. The letters from Thorne prove the debt and threats, and I've got 2 witnesses who heard you threaten Nayland's life. He nodded to Jim and Samuel. That's enough for Judge Harrison to hold you for trial. 2 of Garrett's ranch hands stepped forward with ropes, but they didn't move to stop the marshal. Instead, they stood beside Tanner, their faces hard. We'll help you, Marshal, one of them said. We signed on to work cattle, not help a man commit murder. Wade made a move toward his rifle, still lying on the ground where Jim had dropped it. Jim's boot came down on the weapon, pinning it. Wade looked up, saw Jim's cold eyes, and thought better of whatever he'd been planning. Within minutes, both Garrett and Wade were bound, their hands tied behind their backs. Garrett kept talking, kept protesting, kept threatening legal action and political connections. But nobody was listening anymore. The spell was broken. The Emperor had no clothes, and everyone could see it. As the marshal prepared to take the prisoners back to town, Henry Cole approached Nayleen. He stood awkwardly for a moment, his hat in his hands, then spoke. Ma'am, I owe you an apology, a big one. What we did today, what I allowed to happen, was wrong. I've got no excuse for it except cowardice and prejudice. Nayland studied him with those dark, penetrating eyes. Words are easy, Mr. Cole. What will you do different tomorrow? Henry swallowed hard. I've got 40 acres on the north section of my property. Good land. Creek runs through it. There's a cabin there. Needs some fixing up, but it's sound. If you'd be willing, I'd like to hire you. $30 a month plus use of the land and cabin. You know this territory better than any of us. Know how to read weather, track game, find water. That knowledge is worth something. Why? Why offer this now? Because my wife is right. I should be ashamed. And the only way to live with that shame is to try to do better. He paused. Also because it's the right thing to do. Should have been doing it all along. Nayland was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. I will think about your offer. That's all I can ask. Caleb Morrison stepped forward next. Got work for you too if you're interested. Can always use someone who knows horses and livestock. And my wife's been wanting to learn about native plants. Which ones are good for medicine? She's the closest thing to a doctor we've got in town. More people came forward. The blacksmith, the storekeeper. Even the mother of the boys who'd thrown stones, her face twisted with genuine remorse. One by one, they offered apologies, offered work, offered a chance at something resembling normal life. Not everyone. Some still stood back, faces hard, unwilling to forgive or forget. Change comes slowly, and some people never change at all. But enough stepped forward. Enough that Nolan's expression began to soften, the hard shell of survival cracking slightly to show the woman underneath. Jim watched it all with a strange mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. He'd done what he set out to do, stop the injustice, Save the woman. But what now? He was still a wanted man in Texas, still a drifter with no home and no future beyond the next job. As if reading his thoughts, Nolan turned to him. What about you, cowboy? Where will you go now? Don't know. Somewhere else, I suppose. That's what I do. Move on before questions get asked. Henry Cole's offer includes a cabin. Cabin is too big for one person. Would need someone to help fix the roof, repair the fence, work the land. Her eyes met his. Someone who knows ranch work. Someone who is not afraid to stand up when standing up is hard. Jim felt something shift in his chest. You asking me to stay? I am saying I do not want to be alone anymore. I am saying you helped me when you did not have to. I am saying maybe we both deserve a chance to stop running. Before Jim could respond, Marshal Tanner approached. Mr. Crawford, I'll need your full statement about tonight's events. Breaking and entering is still a crime, even with good intentions. I understand, Marshal. However, Tanner continued, given the circumstances, given that you were acting to prevent a greater crime, and given that you surrendered peacefully and cooperated fully, I'm inclined to accept a plea of necessity. Judge might see it the same way, might not even press charges. And if he does, then you'll pay a fine and do some community service. Help rebuild Garrett's office, maybe. But I doubt it'll come to that. Tanner's stern face softened slightly. You did right tonight, son. Wasn't legal, but it was right. Sometimes those two things don't align perfectly. Jim nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The crowd began to disperse as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The fire was out, leaving Garrett's office a blackened ruin but the rest of the house intact. Garrett and Wade were loaded into a wagon for transport to the jail in town. Garrett's wife Margaret appeared from somewhere, her face pale and shocked, her two daughters clinging to her skirts. Reverend Wright took them aside, speaking quietly, offering comfort. Samuel approached Jim and Nellen, his young face exhausted but peaceful. I wanted to thank you, both of you, for giving me the courage to do the right thing. You found that courage yourself, Jim said. We just gave you a reason to use it. My father's going to lose his job now. With Garrett Byer arrested, the ranch will probably be sold to pay his debts. We'll have to leave Red Mesa. Maybe not, Henry Cole said, overhearing. I'll need a new foreman. Your father's a good man, Samuel. Honest. Hard-working. Tell him to come see me tomorrow. We'll work something out. Samuel's eyes widened. Really? You do that? This town needs good people. People willing to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them. Your father raised you well. That speaks to his character. As Samuel hurried off to find his father with the good news, Jim felt the exhaustion of the long night catching up with him. His shoulder ached from the fight with Wade. His throat was raw from smoke. His hands were blistered from beating out flames. But he felt more alive than he had in 5 years. Nolan touched his arm gently. Come, we should go back to my camp, rest. Then tomorrow we can look at this cabin Henry Cole speaks of. They walked together through the pre-dawn darkness, back toward Devil's Spine Ridge. The desert was cooling, the brutal heat of day giving way to the surprising chill of night. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, constant and eternal. Halfway there, Nayland stopped. Jim stopped beside her, waiting. In my culture, she said quietly, when someone saves your life, you are bound to them, connected, like family. You saved my life today. Maybe twice, 3 times if you count stopping Garrett from having me killed later. You saved mine too. That fire, Wade's rifle. We saved each other. Then we are bound, connected. She looked up at him, her scarred face beautiful in the starlight. I do not know if I can love again, if my heart is capable of it after so much loss, but I am willing to try if you are. Jim thought about Mary, about 5 years of running, about his father's watch and the words engraved there. Honor above all. Maybe honor wasn't just about fighting. Maybe it was also about staying, about building instead of destroying, about loving instead of hiding. I'd like that, he said. I'd like to try. She took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his larger ones. They stood there for a moment, 2 broken people holding on to each other in the darkness, both of them afraid and hopeful in equal measure. Then they continued walking, hand in hand, toward whatever future they could build together. 3 months later, on a cool December morning, Jim stood on the porch of the cabin and watched the sun rise over Devil's Spine Ridge. The cabin roof was fixed, new shingles gleaming. The fence around the property was mended. A small garden plot had been turned and would be ready for spring planting. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Inside, Nylan moved around the kitchen, comfortable now in this space that was becoming home. She wore a simple cotton dress, different from her ceremonial buckskin, but she still kept that beaded dress carefully wrapped and stored. Some things were too precious to wear every day. The town had changed in those 3 months. Not completely. Some people still crossed the street when they saw Nylan coming, still whispered, still called her names when they thought no one could hear. But others had changed. Rosemary Cole had become a friend, teaching Nylan to bake bread and learning from her about desert plants. Caleb Morrison's wife visited twice a week, sitting in the cabin for hours discussing medicine and remedies. The Reverend had invited them to church. They hadn't gone yet, but the invitation stood. Garrett Holloway was in prison in Tucson, awaiting trial on multiple charges. His ranch had been sold to pay debts. His wife and daughters had moved back east to live with family. Wade had turned state's evidence against his uncle in exchange for a lighter sentence. The details that emerged during the investigation had shocked even those who thought they knew Garrett well. The extent of his debts, his schemes, his willingness to commit murder to protect his reputation. Samuel Brennan worked for Henry Cole now, learning the ranch business from the ground up. His father was Cole's foreman, respected and well paid. Samuel's mother had improved slightly with better medicine and regular care, though everyone knew that cancer would claim her eventually. But she was comfortable, surrounded by family, and that was all anyone could ask. Jim had found work with several ranchers, rotating between properties, using his skills with horses and repair work. He'd become known as reliable, honest, a man who did what he said he'd do. The questions about his past had been few and quiet. People in Red Mesa had learned that everyone came west running from something. What mattered was who you were now, not who you'd been. He'd written to his family in Texas, a long letter explaining what had happened with Mary, taking responsibility for his part in her death by inaction, asking not for forgiveness, but for understanding. He didn't know if they'd received it, didn't know if they'd reply, but he'd sent it, and that was enough. The door opened behind him. Nylan came out, 2 tin cups of coffee in her hands. She handed him one and stood beside him, looking at the sunrise. Beautiful, she said. Yes. I was not talking about the sunrise. Jim smiled, something he'd been doing more often lately. Neither was I. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the day begin, 2 survivors who'd found something neither had expected. Hope. Not the naive hope of youth, untested and ignorant of pain, but the harder, more precious hope of those who'd survived the worst and still chose to believe in better tomorrows. I have been thinking, Nylan said, about names. Names? If we are to build a life here, if we are to be family, I should have an American name too. For the legal papers, for the town. I will always be Nalin in my heart, in my prayers, when I speak to the spirits of my people. But for this new life, I should have a name that bridges both worlds. What name did you have in mind? I do not know. I thought perhaps you could help me choose. Jim thought for a moment. What about hope? It's what you've given me, what we found together. Nylan considered this, testing the word on her tongue. Hope, yes, I like this. Nylan Hope Crawford, if you are willing to make me your wife. Is that a proposal? In my culture, women can propose to men if the man is too slow to ask. There was amusement in her Sir Warmus, the dry humor he'd learned to recognize and treasure. Well then, in that case, yes. Yes, I'll marry you if you'll have a broken-down cowboy with more past than future. I will have you, we will have each other, and we will have a future because we choose to build one. They went inside as the sun climbed higher, leaving the porch and the rising day behind. Inside was warmth and coffee, and the smell of breakfast, and the promise of ordinary days stretching ahead. Inside was home. 1 year later, Jim stood in the same spot on the same porch, watching another sunrise. But this time, his hand rested on Hope's swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and roll inside her and 7 months along. The doctor in Tucson said it was a boy, though they decided not to name him until after he was born. Too many things could go wrong, too many losses in both their pasts to take anything for granted. But Hope was healthy, strong. The pregnancy had been easy so far, and Jim had found himself believing, truly believing, that this child would live, would grow, would carry forward something of both of them into a future they couldn't imagine. The town had thrown them a wedding the previous spring. Reverend Wright had performed the ceremony. Half of Red Mesa had attended. Henry and Rosemary Cole had hosted the reception in their barn. There had been music and dancing and more food than Jim had seen in years. Some people hadn't come, had stayed away in protest or prejudice, but most had celebrated with them. Caleb Morrison had given them a matched pair of horses as a wedding gift. Samuel Brennan, now 19 and engaged to the schoolteacher's daughter, had built them a new porch swing. Rosemary had sewn Hope a wedding dress, simple but beautiful. The town had accepted them, mostly, in the grudging way frontier communities accept anyone willing to work hard and live honestly. "What are you thinking?" Hope asked. She'd come up beside him silently, the way she still moved despite her pregnancy. "About how far we've come, how different life is now. Better different or worse different. So much better I can barely remember what worse felt like." She smiled, the scar on her face crinkling in a way he'd come to love. "Liar, you remember. We both remember. But that is good. We should remember. It makes us grateful for what we have now." A rider appeared on the horizon, heading toward their cabin. As he drew closer, Jim recognized Samuel. The young man pulled up in front of the porch, his horse blowing hard. "Jim, Hope, you need to come to town. There's someone there asking for you." "Who?" Jim felt old instincts kick in, the wariness of a man who'd spent years running. "Says his name is Thomas Crawford. Says he's your brother." Jim's hand tightened on the porch rail. "My brother. He got your letter. Read it to your whole family. Your father sent him to find you, to tell you—" Samuel paused, emotion thick in his voice. "To tell you that you're forgiven, that you should come home." Jim felt Hope's hand slip into his, felt her squeeze gently, looked down at her and saw understanding in her eyes. His family wanted him back, wanted to forgive him for Mary, for the killing, for the years of silence. "What will you do?" Hope asked. Jim looked at the cabin they'd built together, the land they were working, the community that had accepted them, the child growing in Hope's belly, the life they'd carved out of nothing. "I'm already home to him," he said. "But we'll go to town, meet Thomas, thank him for coming all this way, and I'll write another letter. Tell my family about you, about our son, about the life I've found here. Invite them to visit if they're willing. They may not accept me. I am Apache. Your people and my people have been enemies. Then they're not my people anymore. You're my people. This baby is my people. The folks in Red Mesa who stood by us, they're my people. Blood doesn't make a family. Choice does." Hope's eyes glistened with tears, but she was smiling. "When did you become so wise, cowboy?" "When I met a woman who taught me that survival isn't enough, that we're meant for more than just existing, that love is worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a whole life around." They rode to town together, Hope sitting side saddle in front of Jim, his arms around her, protecting her and their unborn child. When they arrived, they found Thomas Crawford waiting in front of the general store, a tall man with Jim's jawline and their father's eyes. The reunion was awkward at first, 5 years of silence standing between them like a wall. But Thomas had come 1,000 miles to find his brother, had brought forgiveness from a father who'd spent 5 years believing his youngest son was dead, had brought news of home and family and the ranch that still stood in the Texas Panhandle. They talked for hours, sitting in the cabin, Hope brewing coffee and serving the last of Rosemary's apple pie. Jim told the story of the past year, of Nolan and Garrett, and the night they'd risked everything for truth. Hope told her own story, harder, more painful, but necessary for Thomas to understand who his brother had married. When the stories were done, Thomas sat back and looked at them both with wonder. "You did something extraordinary here, built something real out of nothing." "We had help," Jim said. lots of help. Still, I'm proud of you, little brother. Mary would be proud, too. The words hit Jim like a physical blow. For 5 years, he'd carried the weight of failing his sister, of letting her die. And here was Thomas, offering absolution, speaking for Mary from beyond the grave. I should have saved her, Jim said, his voice rough. Maybe, or maybe you'd be dead too. We'll never know. But I know this, Jim. You've saved someone else. You've stood up when it mattered. You've built a life worth living. That's not nothing. That's everything. Thomas stayed for 3 days, getting to know Hope, seeing the town, meeting the people who'd become his new family. When he left, he carried letters for their father, for their remaining brother, for the aunts and cousins scattered across Texas, and he carried an invitation for them all to come for the baby's birth if they could make the journey. As they watched Thomas ride away, heading back toward Texas in the past they'd both left behind, Hope leaned against Jim and sighed contentedly. Do you think they will come, your family? I don't know, maybe, maybe not, but we've got family here. That's enough. More than enough. They went inside, back to the ordinary rhythms of life. Jim repaired a section of fence while Hope worked in the garden, planting seeds that wouldn't sprout until spring, but needed to be in the ground now. They cooked dinner together, ate at the table Jim had built, washed dishes side by side in the basin. Ordinary things, unremarkable things, the kind of things Jim had never thought he'd have again. That night, lying in bed with Hope curled against him, her breathing slow and steady with sleep, Jim thought about the journey that had brought him here, from Texas to Red Mesa, from guilt to redemption, from loneliness to love. He thought about the woman in the square with a sack over her head and the choice he'd made to kneel beside here. One choice, one moment, and everything had changed. They'd called her a beast, put a sack over her head to hide her humanity. But when he'd looked inside, when he'd seen past the sack and the scar and the prejudice, he'd found something precious. He'd found a woman with more courage and heart than anyone he'd ever known. He'd found a partner, a lover, a wife, a future. He'd found home. Jim's hand rested on Hope's belly, feeling their son move beneath her skin. This child would grow up knowing both worlds, would carry Crawford blood and Apache heritage, would be proof that enemies could become family, that hatred could transform into love, that the sins of the past didn't have to define the promise of the future. As Jim drifted toward sleep, he thought he heard his father's voice, felt the weight of the pocket watch he still carried. Honor above all. He'd tried to live by those words and failed. Had spent 5 years running from that failure. But maybe honor wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about getting up when you fell, about trying again, about standing for something when standing was hard. He'd stood for Hope. She'd stood for him. And together they'd built something worth having. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the land. The stars turned in their eternal dance. The night embraced the cabin where two souls, broken and mended, slept in each other's arms. They'd called her the beast, but Jim had found her heart, and in finding it, he'd found his own. And that, he thought it as sleep finally claimed him, was the truest kind of redemption there was.